Grandfather's unthinkable crime exposed after daughters take DNA test. The town of Oak Haven, nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, was a place of quiet charm and close-knit community. The Miller's house, a modest two-story colonial on a tree-lined street, blended seamlessly into the landscape of well-kept homes and manicured lawns. To the outside world, they appeared to be a typical, if somewhat quiet, American family. And Miller, at 36, was a woman of quiet strength and a gentle demeanor. She worked as a librarian at the local elementary school, a job she loved, finding solace in the ordered world of books and the bright innocence of children. She was a devoted mother to her two daughters, Sarah, 16, and Emily, 10, her life revolving around their needs and their well-being. Sarah, the elder daughter, was a bright and ambitious teenager, excelling in her studies and dreaming of a future beyond Oak Haven. She was popular, outgoing, and involved in numerous school activities. She was also, in many ways, her mother's confidant, a source of support and companionship in a household that often felt strangely silent. Emily, the younger daughter, was a quiet and introspective child, with a sensitive nature and a love for drawing and animals. She was more reserved than her sister, preferring the company of her books and her imagination to the social whirl of school and peer groups. She had a close bond with her mother, but there was also a subtle distance, a sense of unspoken anxieties that she couldn't quite articulate. Living with them was Joseph, Anne's father, a retired carpenter in his late 60s. He was a quiet, imposing man, with a stern demeanor and a deeply ingrained sense of traditional values. He had moved in with Anne and her daughters after his wife, Mary, had passed away 5 years earlier. He helped with household chores, looked after Emily when Anne was at work, and was a constant presence in their lives. The relationship between Anne and Joseph was unusually close, even for a father and daughter. They shared a deep bond, a silent understanding that often excluded others, and relied heavily on her father for emotional support, and Joseph, in turn, seemed to derive a sense of purpose and fulfillment from caring for his daughter and granddaughters. There was a subtle intensity to their interactions, a possessiveness that sometimes made Sarah uncomfortable. She had noticed, over the years, the way her grandfather looked at her mother, the way he touched her, the way he seemed to dominate her thoughts and decisions. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something about their relationship that felt off. She had tried to talk to her mother about it, but Anne had dismissed her concerns, attributing them to teenage jealousy and a misunderstanding of their close bond. Sarah had learned to keep her observations to herself, to bury her unease beneath the surface of their seemingly normal family life. But the feeling lingered, a subtle undercurrent of tension that ran beneath the quiet routines of their daily existence. The Millers, to the outside world, were a picture of small-town normalcy, but within the walls of their home, a complex web of relationships and unspoken secrets was about to be unraveled by a medical mystery that would shatter their carefully constructed world. The chain of events that would irrevocably alter the Miller family's lives began with a seemingly minor health issue. Sarah, the vibrant and energetic 16-year-old, started experiencing unusual fatigue, accompanied by unexplained nausea and a persistent lower back pain. Initially, Anne dismissed her daughter's complaints as typical teenage ailments, stress from school, hormonal changes, or perhaps a simple virus. She advised Sarah to rest, drink plenty of fluids, and take over-the-counter pain medication. But the symptoms persisted, and Sarah's normally cheerful disposition gave way to a growing listlessness and irritability. She started missing school, her grades began to slip, and she withdrew from her friends and extracurricular activities. Anne, increasingly concerned, finally took Sarah to see Dr. Evans, their family physician. "We can maintain consistency with previous stories, though it's a small town. So perhaps a different doctor would be more realistic. Let's call him Dr. Harris for this story." Dr. Harris conducted a thorough examination, asking detailed questions about Sarah's symptoms, her medical history, and her lifestyle. Sarah, hesitant and embarrassed, downplayed her symptoms, attributing them to stress and fatigue. She avoided eye contact, her body language conveying a sense of unease and secrecy. Dr. Harris, a seasoned physician with a keen eye for detail, noticed Sarah's discomfort and the subtle inconsistencies in her story. He ordered a series of routine blood tests, including a complete blood count and a hormone panel, to rule out any underlying medical conditions. The results of the blood tests were perplexing. Sarah's hormone levels were slightly elevated, and her white blood cell count was mildly elevated, suggesting a possible infection or inflammation. But there was no clear indication of any specific illness or disease. Dr. Harris, concerned about the unexplained symptoms and the subtle abnormalities in the blood work, decided to order further testing. He suggested a genetic screening, explaining to him that it might help identify any underlying predispositions to certain medical conditions. Anne, initially hesitant about the cost and the potential implications of genetic testing, eventually agreed. She trusted Dr. Harris, and she was desperate to find out what was wrong with her daughter. Little did she know that this seemingly routine medical decision would unravel a family secret so dark, so deeply buried, that it would shatter their lives forever. The medical mystery was just the beginning, a prelude to a shocking revelation that would expose the hidden trauma and unimaginable betrayal that lay at the heart of the Miller family. The genetic testing, intended to identify a medical condition, would instead uncover a truth far more disturbing. A truth that would challenge everything they believed about themselves and their family. The genetic testing process was straightforward. Sarah provided a saliva sample, which was sent to a specialized laboratory for analysis. The results were expected to take several weeks, a period of anxious waiting for Anne and Sarah. During this time, Sarah's symptoms continued, causing her increasing discomfort and anxiety. She confided in her best friend, Jessica, sharing her fears and her growing sense of unease. Jessica, concerned and supportive, urged Sarah to talk to her mother, to be open and honest about what she was experiencing. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt a strange sense of shame, a feeling that she was somehow responsible for her own discomfort. She also sensed a deep-seated resistance from her mother, a reluctance to delve too deeply into the underlying causes of her symptoms. Anne, meanwhile, tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, focusing on her work, her household chores, and her younger daughter, Emily. She pushed aside her own anxieties, convincing herself that Sarah's symptoms were simply a temporary ailment, a minor health issue that would soon resolve itself. She also found herself increasingly relying on her father, Joseph, for support. She confided in him about her worries, seeking his reassurance and his guidance. Joseph, as always, was a calming presence, a source of strength and stability. He listened patiently, offering words of comfort and assuring her that everything would be all right. He also, subtly, reinforced her denial, suggesting that Sarah's symptoms were likely due to stress or hormonal changes, and that the genetic testing was unnecessary, a waste of time and money. He seemed strangely resistant to the idea of uncovering any hidden truths, any secrets that might disrupt the carefully constructed order of their family life. As the weeks passed, the tension in the Miller household grew. Sarah became more withdrawn, her anxiety increasing, her physical symptoms persisting. Emily, sensitive and observant, noticed the changes in her sister, then spoke in tension between her mother and grandfather, and the growing sense of unease that permeated their home. Finally, the day arrived when the results of the DNA test were due, and received a phone call from Dr. Harris's office, requesting an urgent appointment to discuss the findings. The call filled her with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong, that the results of the test would change their lives forever. She arranged for Joseph to pick up Emily from school, and she drove to Dr. Harris's office, her heart pounding, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She was about to enter a storm, a maelstrom of revelations that would shatter her world and force her to confront a truth she had long avoided. The DNA test, a seemingly routine medical procedure, was about to become the catalyst for a family tragedy, exposing a secret that had been hidden for far too long. Dr. Harris's office was quiet and sterile, the air thick with the antiseptic smell of a medical practice. Anne sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a desperate hope that somehow, everything would be all right. Finally, Dr. Harris emerged from his office, his expression grave. He led into a small, private consultation room, closing the door behind them. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice somber, "I have the results of Sarah's genetic testing, and I'm afraid the news is difficult." He paused, choosing his words carefully, aware of the devastating impact they would have. The tests revealed a number of significant anomalies. He continued. Firstly, they confirmed that Sarah and Emily are indeed full sisters, sharing the same biological mother. And nodded, relieved that at least one piece of her known reality was confirmed. However, Dr. Harris continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the tests also show an unexpected paternity. Emily's biological father is not who you believe him to be. And stared at him, her mind struggling to process the information. What are you saying? She stammered. Dr. Harris took a deep breath. The DNA analysis indicates a very close familial relationship between Emily's father and Sarah, closer than should ever be possible between siblings' parents, and felt a chill run down her spine, a growing sense of horror. I don't understand, she whispered. Dr. Harris looked at her directly, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and professional concern. Mrs. Miller, he said gently, the DNA shows that Emily's father is also Sarah's father. The words hung in the air, heavy and horrifying, and felt the room spin, her body going numb with shock. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was impossible. It couldn't be true. That's not possible, she gasped, her voice trembling. There must be some mistake. Dr. Harris shook his head. I understand this is incredibly difficult to process, Mrs. Miller, he said, but the DNA results are conclusive. There is no mistake. The genetic markers are undeniable. He explained, in simple terms, the science behind the DNA analysis, the statistical impossibility of any other explanation. He emphasized the need for immediate action, for protecting Emily and Sarah, and for reporting the findings to the authorities. Anne, overwhelmed by the enormity of the revelation, broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Her world, her carefully constructed reality, had shattered into a million pieces. Her father, the man she had trusted, the man she had relied on, was a monster. And her daughter, her precious Emily, was the product of his unspeakable crime. Dr. Harris, recognizing the urgency of the situation, made the call. He contacted 911, reporting the suspected child abuse and requesting immediate police intervention. He also contacted Child Protective Services, ensuring that both Emily and Sarah would be placed in protective custody. The doctor's call was the moment of truth, the shattering of denial, and the beginning of a long and painful journey towards justice and healing. It was a moment that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved, a moment that would expose the dark secret that had festered beneath the surface of the Miller family for far too long. The arrival of the police and Child Protective Services at the Miller home was swift and decisive. Anne, still reeling from Dr. Harris's revelation, was in a state of shock, unable to fully comprehend the enormity of what was happening. Two officers, a man and a woman, arrived first, their expressions grim and professional. They explained to Anne that they were there to investigate a report of child abuse, and that they needed to speak to her, Sarah, and Emily separately. Sarah, who had been in her room, unaware of the unfolding drama, was called downstairs. She saw the police officers, her mother's tear-streaked face, and the general atmosphere of chaos, and her heart sank. She knew, instinctively, that something terrible had happened. Emily, playing quietly in her room, was gently escorted downstairs by a CPS worker, a kind-faced woman who introduced herself as Ms. Thompson. Ms. Thompson explained to Emily that they were there to help her, to keep her safe, and to make sure that she was okay. Joseph, who had arrived home from running errands shortly after the police, was immediately taken aback by the scene. He demanded to know what was going on, his voice rising in anger and confusion. The officers, calmly but firmly, explained the situation, informing him of the DNA results and the allegations against him. Joseph's reaction was one of stunned disbelief, followed by a furious denial. "That's impossible," he shouted, his face turning red. "It's a lie. I would never do such a thing." He turned to Anne, his eyes pleading for support, for denial. But Anne, her face pale and stricken, could only stare at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror, betrayal, and a growing, sickening realization. She couldn't speak, couldn't defend him, couldn't deny the undeniable truth that had been revealed by the DNA test. The officers, seeing Joseph's escalating agitation and Anne's obvious distress, decided to separate the family members. Joseph was escorted outside, placed in a police car, and informed that he was being detained for questioning. Sarah and Emily were taken to separate rooms, each accompanied by a CPS worker, to be interviewed in a safe and supportive environment. Anne, left alone in the living room, collapsed onto the sofa, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The reality of the situation, the full weight of the betrayal and the abuse, crashed down on her with crushing force. Her father, the man she had trusted implicitly, the man she had relied on for support and guidance, had violated her in the most unimaginable way. And her daughter, her precious Emily, was the living embodiment of that violation. She struggled to breathe, to think, to make sense of the shattered fragments of her life. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a physical manifestation of the disgust and horror she felt. She wanted to scream, to rage, to lash out at the injustice of it all. But she was paralyzed by shock, by grief, by a profound sense of loss and betrayal. Meanwhile, Sarah, in a separate room, was being interviewed by Ms. Thompson, the CPS worker. She was initially confused and frightened, unsure of what was happening, why the police were there, and why her grandfather had been taken away. Ms. Thompson, gently and patiently, explained the situation to Sarah, using simple language and avoiding graphic details. She told her that there had been a medical test, and that the results had revealed a secret about Emily's parentage. Sarah, struggling to comprehend the implications, asked questions, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't understand how such a thing could be possible, how her family, her seemingly normal family, could be hiding such a dark and terrible secret. Emily, in another room, was being interviewed by a different CPS worker, a specialist trained in dealing with child abuse cases. Emily, quiet and withdrawn, responded to the questions with hesitant nods and whispers, her body language conveying a deep-seated fear and trauma. She didn't understand the complexities of the DNA test, the implications of the adult conversations swirling around her. She only knew that something terrible had happened, that her family was falling apart, and that the familiar world she had known was gone forever. The initial shock and denial began to give way to a range of emotions: confusion, fear, anger, and a profound sense of loss. The Miller family, once a seemingly cohesive unit, was now fractured, fragmented, and facing an uncertain future. A future irrevocably altered by the devastating revelation that had shattered their lives. The investigation was just beginning, but the emotional toll on each family member was already immense, a testament to the deep and lasting impact of the hidden abuse. With Joseph in custody and the children safely under the care of Child Protective Services, Detective Rossi and her team launched a full-scale investigation. Their immediate priorities were to gather evidence, interview all parties involved, and ensure the well-being of Sarah and Emily. The investigation was divided into two main tracks: the criminal investigation, focused on gathering evidence to prosecute Joseph, and the child protection investigation, focused on assessing the safety and well-being of the children and determining the best course of action for their future care. Detective Rossi led the criminal investigation, working closely with the district attorney's office to build a strong case against Joseph. They obtained search warrants for the Miller home and Joseph's personal belongings, seeking any evidence that might corroborate the DNA findings and shed light on the extent of the abuse. The search of the Miller home yielded disturbing results. Investigators found hidden compartments in Joseph's workshop, containing old photographs, letters, and personal items that suggested a long history of inappropriate behavior towards Anne, dating back to her childhood. They also recovered digital devices, including computers and cell phones, which were sent to a forensic team for analysis. The digital evidence revealed a trove of disturbing images and videos, further confirming Joseph's predatory nature and his long-term abuse of Anne. Meanwhile, the child protection investigation, led by Ms. Thompson and her team, focused on interviewing Sarah and Emily, assessing their emotional and psychological needs, and determining the best course of action for their long-term care. Sarah, initially overwhelmed and confused by the situation, gradually began to open up to Ms. Thompson. She described the unsettling feeling she had always had about her grandfather's relationship with her mother, the subtle signs of possessiveness and control that she had witnessed over the years. She also expressed her guilt and shame for not recognizing the truth sooner, for not protecting her sister from the abuse. Emily, still traumatized and withdrawn, was interviewed by a child psychologist specializing in trauma and abuse. The interviews were conducted gently and patiently, using age-appropriate language and techniques to help Emily express her feelings and share her experiences. Emily, though initially hesitant, gradually began to reveal details of her grandfather's inappropriate behavior, confirming the worst fears of the investigators. She described instances of touching, kissing, and other forms of abuse that had taken place over several years. Her testimony, though heartbreaking, was crucial to the investigation, providing direct evidence of Joseph's crimes and corroborating the DNA findings. The investigation also involved interviewing Anne, who was still in a state of shock and denial. Detective Rossi approached the interview with a combination of firmness and compassion, recognizing that Anne was both a victim and a potential witness. Anne, initially resistant to acknowledging the truth, eventually broke down, confessing to the long history of abuse she had suffered at the hands of her father. She described the manipulation, the coercion, the threats, and the psychological control that Joseph had exerted over her since childhood. Her testimony, though painful and difficult, was essential to building a complete picture of the abuse and to ensuring that Joseph would be held accountable for his crimes. The investigation was a meticulous and painstaking process, a gradual unraveling of a dark and complex family secret that had been hidden for far too long. Each piece of evidence, each interview, each revelation brought them closer to the truth and closer to justice for the victims. As the investigation progressed, the focus increasingly shifted to Joseph, the patriarch of the Miller family, the man who had cast a long and dark shadow over their lives. His carefully constructed facade of respectability and normalcy crumbled, revealing a predator, a manipulator, and a deeply disturbed individual. Detective Rossi delved into Joseph's past, seeking to understand his motivations, his history, and any potential patterns of behavior that might shed light on his crimes. She interviewed former neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances, painting a picture of a man who was both outwardly charming and inwardly controlling. She discovered that Joseph had been a dominant figure in his family, ruling his household with an iron fist and demanding absolute obedience from his wife and daughter. He had been a strict disciplinarian, prone to outbursts of anger, and he had isolated his family from outside influences, keeping them under his constant control. His wife, Mary, had died 5 years earlier, officially from natural causes. However, Detective Rossi uncovered evidence suggesting that Mary had suffered years of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of Joseph. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments and seeing Mary with unexplained bruises, but they had been too afraid to intervene. The investigation also revealed that Joseph had a history of inappropriate behavior towards young girls, dating back to his youth. There were rumors, whispers, and unsubstantiated allegations, but nothing that had ever resulted in formal charges or criminal convictions. He had been a master of manipulation, able to charm and deceive those around him, while simultaneously controlling and abusing those closest to him. He had created a world of secrecy and fear, a world where his victims were silenced and his crimes remained hidden. Detective Rossi also explored Joseph's relationship with Anne, seeking to understand the complex dynamics of power, control, and dependence that had allowed the abuse to continue for so long. She interviewed psychologists and experts in child abuse, gaining insights into the psychological mechanisms of grooming, coercion, and manipulation. She learned that Joseph had likely begun grooming Anne from a very young age, gradually eroding her boundaries, manipulating her emotions, and isolating her from other influences. He had exploited her vulnerability, her need for love and approval, and her dependence on him as a father figure. He had created a web of lies and deceit, convincing Anne that his actions were normal, that they were a sign of his love, and that she was somehow responsible for his behavior. He had brainwashed her, manipulated her, and ultimately violated her in the most horrific way possible. As Joseph's shadow grew longer and darker, the full extent of his depravity became clear. He was not just a flawed man who had made a mistake. He was a calculated predator who had systematically abused and exploited those closest to him for decades. The investigation was a descent into the heart of darkness, a journey into the mind of a man who had betrayed the most fundamental trust, the trust between a father and a daughter. For Anne, the investigation was a brutal awakening, a forced confrontation with a past she had long suppressed and denied. The DNA evidence, the police investigation, and the mounting evidence against her father shattered her carefully constructed reality, forcing her to confront the horrifying truth of her childhood. Initially, she had resisted the truth, clinging to denial, defending her father, and blaming herself. She had been so deeply conditioned by years of manipulation and abuse that she couldn't comprehend the full extent of his betrayal. But as the evidence mounted, as the memories began to resurface, and as she received support from therapists and counselors, she began to see her past with new eyes. She began to remember the incidents she had long suppressed, the subtle manipulations, the inappropriate touches, the whispered threats. She started to have flashbacks, vivid and terrifying memories of her childhood, memories of her father's abuse, memories she had buried deep within her subconscious in order to survive. The flashbacks were overwhelming, disorienting, and emotionally draining, but they were also a crucial part of her healing process, a necessary step towards acknowledging and confronting the trauma she had endured. With the help of her therapist, Dr. Ramirez, we can finally and officially introduce her again here, providing a stable, supportive figure, and begin to piece together the fragmented memories. To reconstruct the narrative of her abuse, she learned about the cycle of abuse, the patterns of grooming and manipulation, and the psychological mechanisms that had allowed her father to control her for so long. She learned that she was not to blame, that she was a victim of a terrible crime, and that her father's actions were a betrayal of the most fundamental trust. She began to understand the ways in which the abuse had shaped her life, her relationships, and her sense of self. She also began to understand her own complicity in Emily's conception. She had been so deeply traumatized, so deeply controlled by her father, that she had been unable to protect her own daughter. She had, unconsciously, perpetuated the cycle of abuse, repeating the patterns of her own childhood. This realization was devastating, filling her with guilt, shame, and a profound sense of self-loathing. But it was also a crucial step towards healing, towards taking responsibility for her actions, and towards breaking the cycle of abuse that had plagued her family for generations. Uncovering the past was a painful and agonizing process, a journey through the darkest recesses of her memory and her soul. But it was also a necessary journey, a path towards healing, towards reclaiming her life, and towards building a future free from the shadow of her father's abuse. It was a testament to her courage, her resilience, and her unwavering determination to protect her daughters and to break the cycle of violence that had defined her family for far too long. While Anne was undergoing her own painful journey of self-discovery, the legal process against Joseph moved forward. He remained in jail, awaiting trial, his attempts to secure bail repeatedly denied. He had hired a high-powered defense attorney, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his chances of acquittal were slim. Detective Rossi, determined to secure a conviction, decided to confront Joseph one last time, hoping to elicit a confession or, at the very least, to gain further insights into his motivations and his state of mind. The confrontation took place in a sterile interrogation room at the county jail. Joseph, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his hair disheveled, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair, sat across from Detective Rossi, his attorney by his side. Detective Rossi began by presenting Joseph with the evidence, the DNA results, the forensic evidence from the house, the testimony of Anne and Emily, and the historical records of his past behavior. She laid out the case against him, meticulously and relentlessly, leaving no room for doubt or denial. Joseph, initially defiant, maintained his innocence, claiming that the DNA evidence was flawed, that Anne and Emily were lying, and that he was the victim of a conspiracy. He tried to portray himself as a loving father and grandfather, a pillar of the community, a man incapable of such horrific crimes. But Detective Rossi, a seasoned interrogator, saw through his lies. She pressed him, challenging his denials, exposing his inconsistencies, and confronting him with the devastating impact of his actions on his family. She spoke of Anne's trauma, of Emily's innocence lost, and of Sarah's confusion and betrayal. She described the pain he had inflicted, the lives he had shattered, and the legacy of abuse he had created. She also presented him with new evidence that had been uncovered during the ongoing investigation, letters he had written to Anne when she was a child. Letters filled with inappropriate language and veiled threats. Photographs he had taken of Anne. Photographs that were deeply disturbing and sexually suggestive. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, with the relentless pressure from Detective Rossi, and with the undeniable truth of his own depravity, Joseph's defenses finally crumbled. He broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, his body shaking with remorse, or perhaps simply the fear of consequences. He made no direct confession. He did not admit his guilt. He did not apologize for his actions, but he stopped denying. And in doing so, his effective guilt was clear. The confrontation was a turning point in the case, a moment of catharsis and a step towards closure. Joseph, stripped of his defenses, his lies exposed, was finally revealed for what he was: a predator, a monster, a man who had betrayed the most fundamental trust. The legal battle would continue, but the moral victory had been won. The truth had been revealed, and justice, though delayed, would finally be served. The revelation of Joseph's abuse and Emily's true parentage had a profound and lasting impact on the relationship between Sarah and Emily. Initially, Sarah was overwhelmed with confusion, anger, and a sense of betrayal. She couldn't comprehend the reality of her sister's parentage, the horrific truth that had been hidden from her for so long. She felt a mixture of emotions towards Emily: pity, compassion, but also a strange sense of resentment, a feeling that Emily was somehow responsible for the upheaval in their lives. She struggled to reconcile her image of her sister with the reality of her being the product of incestuous abuse. Emily, in turn, felt a mixture of fear, shame, and a deep-seated sense of otherness. She had always felt different from Sarah, less loved, less valued. Now, she understood why. She was the living embodiment of a terrible secret, a constant reminder of the trauma her mother had endured. She worried that Sarah would reject her, that she would blame her for what had happened, that she would never be able to see her as anything other than a product of her grandfather's abuse. But as the initial shock subsided, as they began to process the trauma together, a new kind of bond began to form between them. They were no longer just sisters, they were survivors, bound together by a shared experience of abuse, a shared understanding of pain and loss. Sarah, with the help of therapy and the support of her grandparents, began to see Emily not as a symbol of the past, but as a victim, a child who deserved love, protection, and a chance at a normal life. She realized that Emily was not responsible for what had happened, that she was just as innocent as Sarah herself had been. She began to reach out to Emily, offering comfort, support, and a genuine sisterly affection that had been missing from their relationship for so long. She apologized for her initial reactions, for her inability to understand, and for the distance she had created between them. Emily, in turn, began to open up to Sarah, sharing her fears, her anxieties, and her hopes for the future. She found in Sarah a confidant, a protector, and a friend, someone who understood her pain in a way that no one else could. They started to spend more time together, sharing meals, watching movies, and talking about their lives. They began to rebuild their relationship, brick by brick, creating a new foundation of trust, understanding, and mutual support. They also began to attend family therapy sessions together, working with Dr. Ramirez to process the trauma, to navigate their complex emotions, and to build healthy coping mechanisms. They learned to communicate openly, to express their feelings honestly, and to support each other through the difficult times. The journey was not easy. There were setbacks, regressions, and moments of intense emotional pain, but they persevered, drawing strength from each other, from their grandparents, and from the growing network of support that surrounded them. They were sisters and survivors, bound together by a shared trauma and a shared determination to heal, to overcome, and to build a future free from the shadow of the past. Their relationship, once fractured and uncertain, had become a source of strength, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of family love. While Sarah and Emily were navigating their own complex relationship and healing journey, Anne, their mother, was embarking on a parallel path of recovery and self-discovery. She had been the primary victim of Joseph's abuse, enduring years of manipulation, coercion, and sexual violence. The revelation of the truth had shattered her world, forcing her to confront the trauma she had long suppressed and to rebuild her life from the ground up. She continued her therapy with Dr. Ramirez, a process that was both excruciatingly painful and profoundly liberating. She delved into the depths of her past, confronting the memories, the emotions, and the beliefs that had kept her trapped in a cycle of abuse for so long. She learned about the dynamics of trauma, the ways in which abuse can distort a person's sense of self, their relationships, and their perception of the world. She began to understand the mechanisms of dissociation, the coping strategies her mind had employed to protect her from the overwhelming pain of her childhood. She also began to grieve the loss of her innocence, the loss of her childhood, and the loss of the father she had thought she knew. She mourned the life she could have had, the relationships she could have formed, and the person she could have become if she had not been subjected to such horrific abuse. The grieving process was long and arduous, filled with tears, anger, and a profound sense of sadness. But it was also a necessary process, a cleansing of the wounds that had festered for so long, a release of the pent-up emotions that had poisoned her life. As she processed her trauma and began to reclaim her sense of self, her identity, and her power, she started to challenge the negative beliefs she had internalized, the beliefs that she was somehow responsible for the abuse, that she was unworthy of love and respect, that she was fundamentally flawed. She learned to set boundaries, to assert her needs, and to protect herself from further harm. She began to distance herself from those who had enabled or condoned the abuse, including some family members who refused to believe her story or who minimized the severity of Joseph's crimes. She also began to reconnect with her own desires, her own passions, and her own dreams. She had spent so much of her life living in fear, living in the shadow of her father's abuse, that she had lost touch with her own identity, her own sense of purpose. She started to explore new interests, taking classes, joining support groups, and connecting with other survivors of abuse. She discovered a talent for writing, using it as a way to express her emotions, to process her trauma, and to share her story with others. She also began to rebuild her relationship with her daughters, Sarah and Emily. She apologized for her failures as a mother, for her inability to protect them, and for the pain she had caused them. She listened to their stories, validated their feelings, and offered them her unwavering support. The relationship was not without its challenges. There were moments of anger, resentment, and misunderstanding. But there was also a growing sense of empathy, compassion, and a shared determination to heal and move forward. Anne's journey was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for healing, and the enduring power of love. It was a journey of self-discovery, of reclaiming her power, and of building a new life, a life free from the shadow of abuse. It was a long and difficult journey, but it was also a journey filled with hope, with courage, and with the unwavering belief in the possibility of a brighter future. Joseph's trial was swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the irrefutable DNA results, the testimony of Anne, Sarah, and Emily, and the corroborating evidence uncovered during the investigation, his defense crumbled. He eventually pleaded guilty to all charges, accepting a plea bargain that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The guilty plea, while providing a sense of closure and justice, did not erase the pain and the trauma that Joseph had inflicted on his family. The scars of his abuse would remain, a constant reminder of the darkness they had endured. For Anne, Sarah, and Emily, the future was uncertain, a landscape of challenges and possibilities. They had survived the unimaginable. They had broken the cycle of abuse, and they had found strength in each other and in the support of their community. But the healing process was ongoing, a lifelong journey of recovery and self-discovery. Sarah, now a young adult, was preparing to leave for college, pursuing her dream of becoming a lawyer, determined to advocate for victims of abuse and to fight for justice. She carried with her the weight of her past, but she also carried a newfound sense of purpose, a resilience forged in the crucible of trauma. Emily, still a young girl, continued to heal and grow, supported by her sister, her grandparents, and a team of therapists and counselors. She was a bright and sensitive child with a love for art and a passion for animals. She had a long road ahead of her, but she was surrounded by love and protected by those who were determined to give her the childhood she deserved. Anne, having confronted her past and reclaimed her life, continued her therapy, her writing, and her advocacy work. She became a voice for survivors, sharing her story with others, raising awareness about child abuse, and working to create a world where children could feel safe, protected, and loved. She also continued to rebuild her relationship with her daughters, forging a new bond based on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. They were a family, scarred but not broken, bound together by a shared history and a shared determination to create a better future. The open ending of their story reflects the reality of trauma recovery. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes, no magical cures. Healing is a process, a journey, a lifelong commitment to self-care, self-compassion, and self-discovery. Years after the trial, a letter arrived for Anne. It was from a woman she didn't know, a woman living in another state. The woman claimed to be Joseph's daughter, the product of a relationship he had had before he married Anne's mother. She had recently undergone DNA testing as part of a genealogical research project, and the results had revealed a close genetic match to Anne and her daughters. She was seeking information about her biological father, unaware of his crimes, unaware of the devastation he had caused. The letter opened up a new chapter in Anne's life, a new set of questions, and a new potential for both pain and healing. Would she respond to the letter? Would she reveal the truth about Joseph? Would she be willing to connect with this unknown half-sister, a woman who was both a stranger and a potential victim of her father's actions? The decision was hers to make, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. It was a decision that reflected the ongoing complexities of family secrets, the enduring impact of trauma, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The glimmer of hope remained, the resilience of the human spirit was undeniable, but the shadows of the past still lingered. A reminder of the darkness they had overcome and the challenges that still lay ahead. Their story, like life itself, was unfinished, a testament to the enduring power of both trauma and healing, a testament to the enduring struggle for justice, truth, and a future free from the shadow of abuse. This unanswered question, this potential connection to another victim, leaves the story open for a possible sequel, but also serves as a powerful reminder that the consequences of such profound trauma ripple outwards in unexpected and enduring ways.